Well, this quote, analysts like it for good reasons. Why? Because it contrasts actually the mere subjectivity of the opinion with the objectivity of data. But, as already mentioned in the previous speech, how objective are we really when collecting and when interpreting data? This is what my weather app showed last week. It predicted rain with 90% probability. So, obvious question, should you bring an umbrella? Well, based on a study that was conducted in the 70s, it would probably be wise to bring an umbrella. As you can see, the confidence and predicted probability of weathermen and the actual probability of a weather event actually happening is very much aligned. So you see the points going up on that diagonal quite smoothly, which is, let's be honest, actually quite counterintuitive to our daily beliefs. But if you now visited the doctor and the doctor said, hey, I'm 90% confident that you've got pneumonia, should you start taking antibiotics right away? Maybe you want to reconsider that. As you can see, even if the doctor's confidence is actually around 90%, the actual probability that the patients of the doctors who participated in this study had pneumonia was roughly 15%. So this is one example of cognitive biases. This is a systematic error in how information is processed and concluded. Now, both of these groups of professionals actually acted on data. It was not just an opinion, but they reached very different predicted probability, very different confidence, sorry, very different accuracy, actually. So, already here, I'd like to take a quick step back and send a take-home message, which is very simple in that case. If you can be a weatherman and not the other guy. But how do we do that? How do we actually act like weathermen in the example before and not like the doctors? Well, one step in the right direction is knowing about these cognitive biases. And another one would be to apply processes or frameworks that help you to mitigate these cognitive biases. Both things I would like to present to you in the remainder of this short speech. I will focus on the most relevant and most extensively researched cognitive bias, which is the confirmation bias that you probably already heard about. It actually consists of different facets. One is the biased search for information. Now, there was a study conducted in late 60s, and the statement that was shown to the participants was, if a card has a vowel on one side, then it has an even number on the other side. Now, the participants were asked to with as few turns as possible, to see if that statement was actually correct. I'll give you a quick moment to figure out for yourself which cards or which card you would turn. Now, the study results actually showed that most of the participants turned card with the letter A, so to see if there was actually an even number on the other side. Most of the participants also turned the card with the number 4, to see if there was actually a vowel on the other side. However, the correct answer to see if the statement was actually true would be to turn card A and card 7, that is to see if there was an odd number and that there was, sorry. I will quickly plug that in again and then see if hopefully All right. Now it's again on the screen, but unfortunately not on mine. Sorry for that. I'll just go on now again. Okay, so correct would actually be to turn A and 7. I'm not asking how many of you actually wanted to turn 4, but hopefully some were actually. All right, how does that translate to what we do here at Tamedia? Nowadays, we're confronted with a huge wealth of information and data. Now, if you look into Google Analytics, you're confronted with 200 plus metrics and dimensions that you can select from. Now, if you have a strong hypothesis already to start with, then unfortunately, you're quite biased or prone to bias to select the information that is in accordance to the hypotheses that you start with. And this is exactly what the researchers concluded from that experiment. Now, the second facet of confirmation bias is the biased interpretation of information. So even if two persons start with the exact same information, they're very prone to, depending on their prior hypotheses, to interpret the data differently. So one of the studies was conducted here during the 2004 presidential election. There were two groups of people strongly in favor for either of the candidates. And both of the groups were shown contradictory statements of the candidates. And as it turned out, the one group that favored George W. Bush actually rationalized his contradictory statements as not being contradictory at all, and vice versa. So here again, how does that translate to our context? Usually we are quite motivationally invested into what we do. So the most natural hypothesis for us is that what we do actually provides value, provides benefit. However, if we start with that hypothesis in mind, we're prone to interpreting the data that we see in a way that supports our hypotheses, and thus that we might miss some optimization potential. Now, I've only focused on confirmation bias, but the number of cognitive biases, if you look on Wikipedia, is actually quite substantial. So, seeing that picture, the question must arise, are we doomed to subjectivity? Luckily, there were people before us who faced the same issues and came up with interesting conclusions on how to overcome it. One of those people was Richard Sewer, who at that time worked for the CIA, and came up with a framework called Analysis of Competing Hypotheses. This was published and later on released to the public, so you can go and download the original script actually on the analysis of competing hypotheses, which I strongly encourage you to do. It's an interesting read. So how does the analysis of competing hypotheses actually work? Analysis of competing hypotheses consists of a series of steps that you can conduct so to mitigate the bias of cognitive biases. It actually consists of 8 different steps, but I will focus on the first 5 because, in my opinion, this is really the heart and soul of analysis of competing hypotheses. After quickly going through these different steps, I will present to you a short example on how that could actually look like. So in the first step, you will try to identify the possible hypotheses to be considered. So not just to start with one hypothesis and test sequentially one hypothesis after another, but really start elaborating on different hypotheses and causes that could cause a certain piece of evidence. So second, you will make a list of significant evidence and arguments for and against each of the hypotheses. In the third step, and here it gets really rigid as a framework, he suggests to prepare a matrix with hypotheses and evidence so to analyze the diagnosticity of the evidence. The fourth step then to refine the matrix by removing evidence without diagnostic value. Now, why is that important? Because usually if you work with only one hypothesis, then it might be that a piece of evidence supports many different hypotheses, so it doesn't have, or it doesn't yield any diagnostic value. And in the fifth step, which is actually the major part to overcome the confirmation bias, is try to disprove the hypotheses rather than prove them, which is somehow counterintuitive into what we are used to do or what we do in the daily work. All right, so let's say you just published your new shiny iOS app, and unfortunately the downloads are sucking. So let's apply analysis of competing hypotheses to this imaginary example. First step is really to brainstorm, and brainstorming for hypotheses, it makes most sense to have a heterogeneous group of people so that you have different focuses and causes that people can come up to with different hypotheses. So it could be that the users just don't know that the app exists. Could be that technical limitations prevent the download, or that the user face missing features that is actually known to access on the web, but that are not included in the app. In the second step, you would then create a list of evidence for each of the hypotheses separately. So for the hypotheses of missing features in the app that are available on web, you might see different data points that either support or contradict these hypotheses. So for example, you might see by looking in Google Analytics that only 7% of your users have actually visited content not available in the app. And you might see that app ratings and reviews are generally high. Similarly, you would go through all of the hypotheses that you postulated and collect the list of evidence that you can come up with. The third step then outlines basically that more rigid view on the data. So he proposes to have the hypotheses as columns, as you can see there, with H1 missing features in app that are available on web. And now the collected evidence of all of the lists that you created for the rows. So for example, that the share of iOS users is 60%. Now, to evaluate the diagnosticity, it's important that first you will work across the columns so that you judge each piece of evidence that you find across the different hypotheses. So for example, you might see that the share of iOS users among mobile users is 60%, is actually supporting all of the hypotheses that we came up with. For evidence that contradicts a specific hypothesis or that is just not applicable, you would enter minuses or an A's into the matrix cells. Now, the fourth step would then be on remove the non-diagnostic evidence, so that the share of iOS users among mobile users is 60%, supported each and every hypothesis, so it doesn't yield any diagnostic value. It's very similar to a patient going to a doctor and telling the doctor that he had fever, which helps the doctor not that much to infer which illness the patient actually has. Also, if some evidence is not applicable for some of the hypotheses, that doesn't matter. If it supports more than one hypothesis, it just doesn't yield any diagnostic value. So you would remove that part of evidence and work on with a smaller set of evidence in that matrix. Next step, and this is then the heart and soul, so to speak, of analysis of competing hypotheses, would be to work across the rows. So after eliminating the evidence that doesn't have any diagnostic value, you would work across the rows to see if any of the evidence pieces actually is strong enough to disprove the hypotheses. So the main focus that you should have when working here across the rows is whether a piece of evidence can be found that contradicts the hypothesis so strongly that it can be removed. Here again, after that, you will end up with a reduced set of evidence and hypotheses. Optimally, of course, with one hypothesis that you want to investigate in an experiment, for example. But even if there are more hypotheses still remaining, it can give you a hint onto what kind of evidence you still want to collect to ensure that you have the correct hypotheses and work with that hypothesis again. All right, so I'm already at the end, and as we can see, analysis of competing hypotheses can actually be a helpful tool to mitigate the impact of cognitive biases, mainly by two things that it does. And basically, what it does is it starts with a lot of different hypotheses in parallel instead of testing one hypothesis after the other in sequential order. The second is that the focus should be shifted on disproving the hypotheses instead of trying to prove them. It really helps, especially that point, helps you to reduce the influence of cognitive biases on your analysis. To make the connect here again to the research that I showed you before, cognitive biases, the confirmation bias was always focused on finding the information and interpreting the information in accordance with the specific hypotheses. Then again, analysis of competing hypotheses is a great way to create analyses that are actually reproducible for other people. So say if you wanted another person to see the trail of thought that you took until you reached a conclusion, these kind of reduction of matrices and hypotheses and evidence can be a great trail of thought. There's no way around. Analysis of competing hypotheses is definitely time-consuming. So it might be worth considering specifically when questions arise that are that yield the potential to improve quite a lot. But I think these are really the main takeaways. If you already shift a little bit the way on how you look at hypotheses and that you're trying to disprove them instead of trying to find evidence for that hypothesis, that's already a huge step. Brainstorming, this is the brainstorming for different hypotheses is one of the major steps within analysis of competing hypotheses. Because if you don't come up here with a hypothesis that at least narrows that narrows down the problem that you're facing, then obviously analysis of competing hypotheses won't help you. With that in thought, happy analyzing, and thanks for having me.